The oppression of African peoples after they were legally freed from slavery has become something of a guide to the future oppression of African Americans and other minorities. Since the 1820s, African Americans and other minority groups have been oppressed by the dominant white group both educationally and economically. I wanted to give a straightforward timeline of the history of African American education and compare it to the issues urban public schools, which are mostly comprised of African American students and other minorities, have to face. I wanted to split up the history of African American education into 5 separate parts: the education of slaves before the Civil War, the legalization of education of enslaved peoples after the Civil War, the reconstruction of African American rights, the separate but equal ruling, and the desegregation of public schools, and also the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the No Child Left Behind Act. There were a few people who took it upon themselves to educate minorities. In 1695, Reverend Thomas Bray traveled to Maryland to educate and convert enslaved Africans to the Christian religion. 1 year later, in South Carolina, a reverend by the name of Samuel Thomas was one of the several ministers from the Goose Creek Puritans to teach enslaved Africans to read and write and study their religion. In 1704, a Frenchman named Elias Noe opened a private school for Africans and Native Americans in New York. In 1731, the African School for Blacks was established in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, by Anthony Benezet, who also established the Abolitionist Society. He also established a private evening school for Africans in 1750. In 1764, a school for Africans was opened in Virginia. The New Jersey Quakers raised money to open a school for African Americans in 1777. In 1784, Anthony Benezet died and donated all of his money to the education of Africans and American Indians. New York City opened its first African school in 1787. In Philadelphia, the Quakers established the Society for the Free Instruction of the Orderly Blacks and People of Color, which created evening schools for adults. They also opened the Adelphi School and Clarkson Hall for the education of poor children. In 1820, Boston opened its first primary school for Africans. In 1829, St. Francis Academy opened for African girls in Baltimore. The Confederate Union, comprised of the Southern States of America, started and passed many legislations making it illegal to educate peoples of color, mainly Africans. In 1823, Mississippi passed a law forbidding the education of both free and enslaved Africans. The next Southern state to pass a law prohibiting the education of Africans was Louisiana. In 1831, both Alabama and North Carolina outlawed the education of African peoples. In 1831, the legalization of educating enslaved people started to move to the north and other parts of the United States. In 1831, Virginia was the first state up north to outlaw African education. In 1847, Ohio outlawed the education of Africans, and in 1852, Delaware outlawed the education of African and mulattoes, people who are of interracial heritage. The Reconstruction period itself lasted from about 1866 to 1877. In 1861, the Civil War ended, and 2 years later, President Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all enslaved individuals. In 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress to help former slaves adjust to their newfound freedom. The Freedmen's Bureau established over 3,000 schools for people of color. During the Reconstruction period, the first historically black universities and college were founded: Howard University, Fisk University, and Hampton College. In 1896, the court case Plessy v. Ferguson led to the U.S. Supreme Court decision which sanctioned segregation in public places, including schools, as long as they were equal. As a result of another court case in 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court determined any Georgia school board was not responsible for opening a public high school for African American children, and if they wanted to attend high school, that family would have to transfer to a town or city where a public high school was located. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded by W. E. B. Du Bois, the first African American to graduate from Harvard University. In the 1930s, the NAACP began filing suits on behalf of black and white teachers in southern states who received unfair pay. In 1854, the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in the Brown v. Board of Education trial led to the desegregation of all public schools. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1965. The purpose of the ESEA was to make it possible for all children to receive a quality education and encourage them to achieve better grades in school by establishing higher standards for children to strive for. The No Child Left Behind Act is a reauthorization of the ESEA, which was signed into law in 2001. The NCLB Act was intended to benefit low-income, homeless, or neglected families, Native American families, and families with limited education and language skills. For this reauthorization, government-funded schools are required to meet certain guidelines to continue to receive the funding. Schools that do not achieve the goals set by the government are in risk of having their funding cut or worse, losing funding. This believes that education is the key for low-income families to make it to middle class. However, the quality of urban public education which many low-income children attend is much lower than the quality of education middle to upper-class students receive. Students in low-income schools often have to use outdated textbooks, computers, science equipment, and other tools schools should be equipped with. Having to learn in these conditions can be demotivating. Another issue public education faces is the threat of losing funding if they cannot accomplish the standards set by the government. The No Child Left Behind Act is a great plan in theory, but it does not take into account the extra time and effort it takes for impoverished students to catch up to their peers who are on track education-wise. As these often undereducated students fail the standardized testing set forth by the government, their schools continually lose funding and sometimes even close altogether.